Okay, so you want to own a newspaper. Ink-stained presses running through the night. A newsroom full of reporters chasing the truth. Your name on the masthead of an institution that holds the powerful accountable and tells a community its own story. You picture yourself as the steward of something genuinely important, a business with real civic weight behind it. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it, an industry that has lost the overwhelming majority of its revenue over the past 2 decades. Not gradually, but in one of the fastest, most total collapses any American industry has ever experienced. An industry where the product that actually paid the bills for over a century, classified advertising, was essentially deleted overnight by a handful of internet websites nobody in the newsroom ever saw coming. Some newspaper owners have found genuinely durable, even profitable paths through this collapse. Others, including some of the most storied names in American journalism, have been bought, gutted, and stripped for parts by financial buyers who understood something the previous owners didn't, that a dying newspaper's real estate and remaining subscriber list were sometimes worth more than the journalism itself. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why owning a newspaper today, one of the starkest examples in the entire economy of an industry whose core business model simply stopped existing, and why the handful of survivors had to become almost entirely different businesses to make it through. What you're actually buying before the money makes sense. You need to understand that a traditional newspaper was never really one business. It was 3 genuinely different revenue streams bundled together and delivered on the same folded sheets of newsprint. The first, and by far the most profitable historically, was classified advertising, the endless columns of small print listings for jobs, cars, apartments, and personal notices that readers actually sought out and paid to place. A business that functioned essentially as a local, geographically captive marketplace with extraordinarily high margins, since the actual cost of printing a few more lines of text was nearly zero. The second was display advertising, the larger, designed ads from local retailers, car dealerships, and grocery chains that ran throughout the paper. A business built on the newspaper's function as the dominant, sometimes only, way to reach a local audience of any real size. The third, and the one most people think of first when they picture a newspaper's business, was circulation revenue, the money readers themselves paid for a subscription or a single copy, which historically covered only a fraction of the actual cost of producing and delivering the paper, meaning subscribers were never really the customer in the traditional sense. They were the product being delivered to advertisers who were the real customer paying the actual bills. This structural reality, that advertisers, not readers, funded the overwhelming majority of journalism for most of the newspaper industry's modern history, is the single most important fact for understanding everything that happened next. Because when classified advertising specifically, the single most profitable of these 3 revenue streams, migrated almost entirely to specialized internet platforms built for exactly that purpose, the newspaper industry didn't just lose a revenue line, it lost the specific subsidy that had been funding the actual journalism the whole time. The cost of actually running the thing, even in a newspaper's healthiest historical era. Running one required a genuinely substantial physical and editorial infrastructure that most readers never thought about. According to industry data tracked by the News Media Alliance and Academic Studies of Newspaper Economics, a mid-sized metropolitan daily newspaper historically required a printing press facility presenting tens of millions of dollars in capital investment, since offset printing presses capable of producing a full daily run at commercial quality and speed are genuinely enormous. Specialized industrial equipment and many newspapers historically owned and operated this printing infrastructure entirely in-house rather than outsourcing it. A capital commitment that made sense when print was the only distribution method available, but that became an increasingly heavy, difficult to justify fixed cost as circulation volumes began declining. Newsroom staffing represented, and for the survivors still represents, the core editorial cost, and a genuinely comprehensive metropolitan daily historically employed reporters and editors covering city government, courts, business, sports, and features as full beats, along with photographers, copy editors, and page designers. A newsroom headcount that at many major papers ran into the hundreds of employees during the industry's peak, representing a substantial ongoing payroll commitment that existed specifically to produce the comprehensive daily coverage that justified the subscription and advertising rates the paper could charge. Physical distribution represented a genuinely complex and expensive logistics operation in its own right, since delivering a physical newspaper to hundreds of thousands of individual doorsteps every single morning before most readers woke up required an extensive network of delivery trucks, distribution centers, and individual carriers, a logistics infrastructure that functioned essentially as its own transportation business layered on top of the editorial and advertising operations, and one that became increasingly expensive to maintain per remaining subscriber as circulation numbers declined, and the fixed cost of maintaining that delivery network had to be spread across an ever-shrinking base. Newsprint itself, the paper the newspaper is physically printed on, represented a meaningful and historically volatile commodity cost, since newsprint prices fluctuate with broader pulp and paper market conditions, and a large newspaper's newsprint purchasing represented a genuine, non-trivial input cost that added another layer of operating expense on top of the editorial and distribution infrastructure already discussed. The Craigslist extinction event. To understand exactly what happened to this industry's economics, you have to understand the specific mechanism by which its most profitable revenue stream disappeared. And it's a genuinely unusual case study in how quickly and completely a well-established, extraordinarily profitable business line can simply cease to exist. Classified advertising had historically represented, according to industry estimates cited across numerous academic and journalistic analyses of the industry's collapse, somewhere in the range of 30 to 40% of total newspaper advertising revenue at many papers, and it carried genuinely extraordinary margins, since a classified ad required minimal editorial or design labor to produce. Essentially, just typesetting a few lines of text a customer had paid to place. Craigslist, launched initially as a simple community email list before expanding into a genuinely comprehensive, free, geographically organized classified advertising platform across essentially every American city, offered exactly the same core function newspaper classifieds had always provided, connecting local buyers and sellers, job seekers and employers, at essentially zero cost to the user, a value proposition that newspaper classifieds, which charged real money per listing, simply could not compete against once internet access became widespread enough for the platform to reach genuine critical mass. According to various industry analyses conducted in the years following this shift, total newspaper classified advertising revenue in the United States fell from tens of billions of dollars annually at its peak in the late 1990s to a small fraction of that figure within roughly a decade. A collapse concentrated specifically in the exact revenue category that had historically subsidized the newsroom costs that produced the actual journalism. Meaning newspapers didn't just lose a percentage of their business, they lost specifically the highest margin percentage that had been funding everything else. This single structural shift explains an enormous share of why the newspaper industry's subsequent history looks the way it does. Because unlike a gradual, broad-based revenue decline that a business might reasonably restructure around over time, the classified advertising collapse happened with genuine speed relative to how slowly most newspaper organizations, with their unionized newsrooms, expensive physical printing infrastructure, and multi-decade institutional habits, were capable of restructuring in response, creating a genuine mismatch between the speed of the revenue collapse and the speed at which the underlying cost structure could realistically be brought down to match it. The digital advertising trap of classified advertising's collapse represented the first major blow to newspaper economics. The industry's attempt to replace lost print advertising revenue with digital advertising revenue represents a second, subtler, and in many ways more structurally damaging development. Newspapers did successfully build substantial digital readership over the following decade, and digital advertising revenue did grow at many publications. But according to extensive industry financial analysis, digital advertising revenue per reader has historically run dramatically lower than print advertising revenue per reader ever did, meaning even genuinely successful digital audience growth failed to replace anywhere near the total revenue that print advertising had previously generated, a mismatch that has been described throughout the industry using the phrase trading print dollars for digital dimes. This dynamic is driven substantially by the structure of the digital advertising market itself, which according to industry and regulatory analysis has become heavily concentrated around a small number of dominant technology platforms, Google and Meta chief among them, that control the majority of digital advertising spending and the underlying technology infrastructure, the ad exchanges, the targeting data, the measurement tools, that determines how digital ad dollars actually get allocated across the internet, meaning individual newspapers, even large ones, found themselves competing for advertising revenue within a digital ecosystem whose fundamental economics and infrastructure were controlled by companies with no direct stake in journalism's survival. Subscription revenue has become an increasingly central strategic focus for surviving newspapers, specifically in response to this dynamic, with many major papers moving aggressively toward digital subscription paywalls over the past decade, specifically to reduce dependence on an advertising market that had proven structurally unfavorable, a strategy that has worked genuinely well for a small number of large, nationally relevant publications capable of building a large enough digital subscriber base to meaningfully replace lost advertising revenue, but one that has proven considerably harder to execute for smaller regional and local papers whose relevant subscriber base is inherently limited to a specific geographic community, too small to generate comparable subscription scale. The local news desert problem. Consequences of this economic collapse have manifested most severely, and most consequentially for American civic life, at the local and regional level rather than at the largest national publications, according to research tracked by academic centers studying local news, including Northwestern University's Medill School. The United States has lost thousands of local newspapers over the past 2 decades, and the pace of these closures has, if anything, accelerated in more recent years rather than slowing, creating what researchers have termed news deserts, communities that have lost meaningful access to any dedicated local news coverage of their own city council, school board, and local courts. This local news collapse carries genuine civic consequences that extend well beyond simple business failure, and multiple academic studies have found measurable correlations between the loss of local news coverage and outcomes including reduced civic engagement, decreased voter turnout in local elections, and, in some studies, even measurably higher municipal borrowing costs, a finding researchers attribute to reduced scrutiny of local government financial management once the reporters who used to cover city council meetings and municipal bond issuances simply no longer exist. This dynamic has produced a genuinely unusual pattern of ownership consolidation within what remains of the local newspaper industry, with a relatively small number of large newspaper chains, some owned by private equity firms specifically focused on extracting remaining cash flow rather than reinvesting in journalism, acquiring large portfolios of struggling local papers and running them with dramatically reduced newsroom staffing, a strategy that has kept many papers technically alive in name while substantially reducing the actual local reporting capacity they provide, a pattern industry critics have described as harvesting a paper's remaining brand loyalty and advertising relationships for cash flow while allowing the actual journalism that built that loyalty in the first place to steadily erode. The real case study, Alden Global Capital and the hedge fund Modelto understand how explicitly the financial logic of newspaper ownership has shifted away from journalism itself. Look at the strategy pursued by Alden Global Capital, a hedge fund that has become one of the largest newspaper owners in the United States through the subsidiary Media News Group and its acquisition of Tribune Publishing, which owned major metropolitan papers including the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun, and several other historically significant regional dailies. Alden's publicly reported strategy, extensively documented in industry journalism and academic analysis of the company's approach, involves acquiring struggling newspaper companies specifically for their remaining cash flow and often their real estate holdings. Since many older newspapers own valuable downtown office and printing facility real estate accumulated over decades of operation, and then implementing dramatic newsroom staffing cuts, often reducing editorial headcount by 50% or more at acquired papers, while extracting the resulting cash flow rather than reinvesting it into the actual journalism the paper produces. According to reporting from media industry analysts and former employees at all the known papers, this approach has been explicitly criticized within the journalism industry as prioritizing short-term cash extraction over the long-term sustainability of the actual news-gathering operation, with critics arguing that dramatically reduced newsroom staffing inevitably produces a less comprehensive, less locally relevant product that accelerates the very subscriber and advertiser decline the reduced staffing was meant to address financially. A genuinely difficult structural bind, since a newspaper's core product, comprehensive local journalism, requires a certain baseline level of reporting staff to remain competitive against any remaining local news alternatives, meaning cutting staff to preserve short-term profitability can directly undermine the long-term revenue the paper depends on. Alden's approach illustrates a genuinely important structural lesson specific to this industry's current economic reality, because the traditional advertising subsidized business model has genuinely collapsed rather than merely weakened. Some financial owners have concluded that the most rational economic strategy is not attempting to rebuild a sustainable journalism business at all, but rather managing the newspaper as a depreciating cash flow asset, extracting value during an extended, managed decline rather than investing in a turnaround that these owners have judged the underlying economics simply don't support. A genuinely bleak but economically coherent strategy that stands in direct tension with the civic function newspapers have historically served, and one that has made Alden a frequent subject of criticism from journalists, press freedom organizations, and communities that have watched their local paper's newsroom shrink dramatically under this ownership model. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you own a newspaper, likely a large, nationally or regionally significant publication, that successfully built a substantial digital subscriber base large enough to meaningfully replace lost print advertising revenue, while maintaining enough editorial quality and distinctiveness to justify readers paying directly for journalism they can't easily find elsewhere. Your subscription revenue, now the dominant share of total revenue rather than advertising, provides a more stable, direct relationship with your actual customer than the advertising subsidized model ever did. Since a subscriber paying directly for your journalism has chosen specifically to fund what you produce, rather than being a secondary beneficiary of an advertiser's spending decision, your cost structure has been substantially restructured around this new reality, with reduced physical printing and distribution infrastructure as print circulation continues its long-term decline, and a leaner but genuinely well-resourced digital newsroom producing content specifically differentiated, enough to justify the subscription price, against the enormous amount of free content and information available elsewhere online. Publications that have successfully executed this transition have demonstrated that genuine, if modest by the standards of many other industries in this series, sustainable profitability remains achievable, particularly for publications with strong enough brand recognition and journalistic distinctiveness to command genuine reader loyalty. Now the harder scenario. You own a mid-sized regional newspaper without the scale or national brand recognition to build a digital subscriber base large enough to replace lost advertising revenue, competing in a local market where digital advertising dollars have already migrated substantially to Google and Meta regardless of how good your own digital advertising product might be. Your print circulation continues its long-term structural decline, spreading your fixed printing and distribution costs across an ever-shrinking subscriber base and making each remaining print copy more expensive to produce and deliver relative to the revenue it generates. Facing this structural bind, either you or a financial bear who has acquired your paper makes the economically rational, if journalistically bleak, decision to reduce newsroom staffing substantially, extracting the paper's remaining cash flow rather than attempting a costly digital transition that the paper's limited scale makes unlikely to succeed anyway. A decision that further reduces the comprehensive local coverage that historically justified the paper's subscription price and advertiser relationships, accelerating the very decline the cost-cutting was meant to manage. The gap between these two scenarios in a modest variance in a business plan. It's the difference between a genuinely viable, if structurally smaller, journalism business and a managed liquidation of a once essential civic institution, and which scenario a given newspaper falls into depends overwhelmingly on scale, brand strength, and market position that were largely determined before the current owner ever took control, rather than on any operational excellence the current owner might bring to the business. The real payoff, the difference between newspapers that have found a genuinely sustainable path through this industry's collapse and those that have been harvested for their remaining cash flow comes down to a small number of structural realities more than disciplined choices. A genuinely different lesson than most of the businesses examined throughout this series. Scale and brand distinctiveness, specifically the ability to build a digital subscriber base large enough and loyal enough to fund genuine, comprehensive journalism directly through reader payment rather than advertiser subsidy, has proven to be less a matter of choice and more a matter of which papers happen to possess the national or regional relevance necessary to make that transition work at all, meaning many genuinely well-run local papers, however excellent their journalism, simply never had access to a large enough potential subscriber base to replicate what worked for the largest national publications, understanding, with genuine clarity, that the advertiser-subsidized model that funded journalism for over a century has not weakened. It has structurally ended, matters enormously for anyone evaluating this industry today. Since a business plan built around eventually recovering meaningful advertising revenue is built on a foundation that simply no longer exists, meaning the newspapers that have survived were overwhelmingly the ones that abandoned that assumption early and restructured entirely around direct reader revenue instead, and recognizing the genuine tension between newspaper ownership as a journalism mission and newspaper ownership as a financial asset to be harvested during a managed decline represents perhaps the starkest ethical fork in this entire series of businesses, since, unlike almost every other industry examined here, the successful financial strategy for many acquired local papers has become explicitly, deliberately disconnected from producing the actual journalism that historically justified the business's existence and civic value in the first place. The romance of the newsroom, the accountability journalism, the sense of a community's own story being told, is genuinely real, and it's precisely the publications that found a way to fund that romance directly through reader relationship rather than a vanished advertising subsidy that have built something durable, while many others have simply become a depreciating financial asset being managed toward its eventual end, which means the honest answer to whether owning a newspaper can build genuine, lasting wealth today is yes, for a genuinely small number of large, nationally relevant publications that successfully rebuilt their entire economic foundation around direct reader payment. But for the overwhelming majority of local and regional papers, the industry's own recent history has made unmistakably, uncomfortably clear that the old business model, in coming back, and the honest choice facing most remaining owners, in between good and great financial outcomes. It's between managing a genuine decline with some remaining dignity toward the journalism, or extracting what's left as efficiently as possible on the way out. And subscribe to Alma Discover for more videos. Thank you.